guys, so today I'm at the Little Horse Trailhead in Sedona, Arizona, and I'm going to be doing a really quick painting of the end of the Twin Butte, which is right behind me here. You can see that the Chapel of the Holy Cross is right below the butte. It's a really scenically beautiful spot in Sedona, and I'm painting right at sunset, so it's going to be a super quick alla prima sketch, and I'll talk a little bit about how figuring out my main value groups and painting alla prima within those really was a game changer for me in my plein air work. So thanks so much for being here, and see you next time. So this is going to be a really quick sketch because I'm basically arriving to the scene, and the light is exactly the way that I want to paint it, but it's not going to last. It's fleeting as I'm setting up my gear here. So I've really quickly just given my orange stain down to this 8 by 10 inch horizontally formatted panel. And I can see very clearly that I've got a few value groups going on. That band of trees is going to be my darker value. Where the rock is all lit up is my next value mass. And then where it goes into shadow is another value mass. The sky and the ground plane are the lightest. So I know exactly how I'm gonna mix my colors. If I start with middle and dark tones, I will definitely achieve the consistency of this like middle to darker value in this middle section here. And I'm leaning towards orange because of the light on the trees. So I've got alizarin crimson and cadmium medium yellow dominant with ultramarine blue, and that's going to create a very like orange green. And like I mentioned before, I'm keeping that in my middle to darker value system. And the reason this is so important for alla prima painting and why it's kind of changed the game for me is because if I mix into a mixture right on the panel that's already dark with a little bit lighter, that darker value is going to mix into my lighter value, and it's going to keep that whole thing kind of in the same value group, even though I've got shifts of value within the grouping. And the same applies to when I'm painting the lights here. So yeah, you could be like, okay, well, there's shadows in the rock that's lit up, and the vegetation is darker than the sunlight that's hitting the rock. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm mixing that red rock color right into the green vegetation color, and then I'll place the cracks and the shadows into that lighter mixture. And what that's going to do is it's going to keep even the shadow areas of my light value mass on the lighter side. So that's still all going to read as in light. And that also works well because this feature is more off into the distance. So as things recede, they tend to have less value contrast and more atmosphere. So that's all really going to work in my favor. And it helps me to just paint it quickly when I'm just, painting wet into wet and using it to my advantage. Because sometimes when you paint wet into wet, you can kind of just create muddy colors. But if you do it with intention like this, it can really save you a lot of time when you're trying to get those color notes and that light pattern down as it's changing. And so the same is kind of applied to that shadow area. I'm going to drop my shadow vegetation in with that like shadow red rock color. And as I'm going, kind of doing the tops of the trees, because of the intersection of where the tree meets the rock. So getting more of those core shadows in, and also on the ground plane here too. And in all honesty, for just a sketch, that underpainting is really reading as kind of like the color of what the grasses are. But I do know that I want to try to match that color and paint it in. But, if I really just wanted to capture this light, I could kind of invent the rest. I have, the trees and the rocks are really, the information that I'm seeking of how the light has hit these parts of the scene at that particular time of day. A strategy that I've used here, I kind of knew that the light was going to go off of the trees first and then off of the rocks next. So that was my order of operations, painting those trees first and then painting the rock. My last order of business, so to speak, is going to be those clouds. And as we know, the colors of the clouds just keep getting more magical as the sun kind of meets the horizon. You have like those pinks and purples on the base of the clouds, depending on where the angle of the sun is. So I definitely want to have some of that beautiful sunset cloud color. So I'm just going to paint them as I see them and getting in that sky gradient. So at this time of day, the sky closer to the horizon is super light. It's almost got more kind of a yellow tint to it, and then kind of like a more grayish blue as it goes towards the top. And then you can see this beautiful like light purpley color that I'm putting for the base of the clouds. You can see that they're very pink as they transition from that shadow into the light. The light is more of like a yellow pink. A lot of white mixed into it. So all of my sky colors have a lot of white and yellow mixed into them, and that really communicates the depth of the scene. And now I'm just gonna focus on reiterating that beautiful pink transition. This is all, wet into wet because of how rapidly it's changing. And then integrate those edges into the sky color. So when I'm blending, I'm making sure that my brush is clean or that I'm using a different brush. And that'll kind of, help me to not muddy those colors and keep them, the edges where I want it to be kind of mixing. I'll do that, but if I want to not mix them too much, I'll make sure to use a different brush, or, maybe I've got a sky brush and a cloud brush. And just a few finishing touches with some of those dark accents in the trees. My mentor is always getting on me for not putting branches in my trees or like the tree trunks. And, sometimes we can forget about those finishing touches, but they do really, it gives it just that little bit of detail that helps the scene to read even more. And when I do put tree branches and trunks in, I make sure to overlap that with the foliage. so that it doesn't just look like this awkward line that you place. And usually you have like the core shadow of the greenery and then the light on top. So I kind of place those, make sure those are placed respectively. And then going back under some of this brush here and adding some of the darks, and then adding lights to the top of the grasses. So the ground plane hasn't changed too much. The light was really kind of on the tops of the trees and hitting the rocks. So that's why I left the field for last, because I knew that, the light effect wasn't really going to change too much there. It was kind of in shadow when I got here, and so I wasn't worried too much about creating too much like light and shadow relationship there. And anytime I have grasses that recede into the background, I always add like just a touch of blue into that transition usually. And yeah, so this is a really quick study, like I said. There's not really these like orangey bushes in the foreground, but I'm kind of adding them in because I want to just fill out that composition a bit more and add a little bit more weight to the ground. And I think a little bit of that yellow in the foreground really ties it all together. So kind of a last minute decision. Thank you guys so much for watching this as always and joining me on this beautiful plein air adventure in Sedona.